Picture this: it's 11 p.m. the night before what should be the happiest day of your life. Your mother hands you a cup of warm tea for your nerves, sweetheart. You trust her, you drink it, and that's when your world shatters forever as the sedative kicked in. I heard my sister's voice cut through the darkness like a blade: cut her hair off or you'll lose me forever. Through my drugged haze, I watched my own mother pick up electric clippers. The woman who raised me, who promised to love me unconditionally. She chose my golden child sister over me in that moment, and the buzzing sound that followed would haunt me forever. I woke up on my wedding morning completely bald, humiliated, betrayed by my own blood. But here's what my family didn't know: I had allies they never saw coming, evidence they never imagined existed, and a plan that would turn their perfect southern wedding into their worst nightmare. Because when those chapel doors opened and 200 guests saw my bald head, the room didn't just fall silent, it exploded. Audio recordings played, receipts appeared on screen, secrets spanning 3 generations came crashing down like dominoes. What happened next didn't just destroy my family's reputation, it shattered a cycle of abuse that had poisoned our bloodline for decades. By the end of this story, you'll witness the most satisfying revenge you've ever heard and understand why sometimes the most broken people become the strongest warriors. This is my story, and trust me, you've never heard anything like it. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery, and at 32, I thought I had finally escaped the suffocating grip of my Southern Belle mother's expectations. As a successful marketing director for a tech company in Atlanta, I'd built a life 2 hours away from my hometown of Magnolia Springs, Georgia, far enough to breathe, close enough to maintain the facade of family harmony that meant everything to my parents. Tomorrow was supposed to be my wedding day, the culmination of 2 years of planning that had turned into a battleground between my vision of an intimate celebration and my mother's dream of a grand southern spectacle that would cement our family's status as the crown jewel of our gated community. The evening air was thick with Georgia humidity as I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the pale pink wallpaper and antique furniture that had remained unchanged since I was 16. My parents, Charles and Margaret Montgomery, had insisted I spend my final night as a single woman in the house where I grew up, a tradition they claimed that would bring good luck to the marriage. Charles served as chairman of the Magnolia Hills Homeowners Association and was a deacon at First Baptist Church, while Margaret led the ladies' auxiliary and hosted the most coveted dinner parties in our zip code. To the outside world, we were the picture-perfect American family, successful, devout, and unshakably united. The truth was far more complicated, sweetheart. You look absolutely exhausted, my mother said as she glided into my room carrying a delicate china teacup on a silver tray. Margaret Montgomery never simply walked anywhere, she glided, floated, or swept as if perpetually auditioning for the role of Southern matriarch in some grand production. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, and her silk nightgown probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I brought you some chamomile tea with a little something extra to help calm those pre-wedding jitters. I should have been suspicious. In 32 years my mother had never once brought me tea for any reason, let alone to soothe my nerves, but the stress of the past few months had worn me down. The constant battles over guest lists, flower arrangements, and wedding traditions I didn't want but couldn't seem to escape. The tea smelled like home, like the antique rose garden my grandmother had planted behind the house, and I was desperate for anything that might quiet the anxiety churning in my stomach. Thank you, Mama, I said, accepting the cup with both hands. The liquid was warm and sweet with an underlying bitter note that I attributed to the chamomile. I really am nervous about tomorrow. Oh honey, every bride feels this way, she said, settling onto the edge of my bed with the practiced grace of someone who had perfected the art of appearing nurturing while maintaining emotional distance. Your sister Melissa felt the exact same way before her engagement party last month. Speaking of which, where's that girl? She was supposed to come say goodnight. As if summoned by her name, Melissa burst through the bedroom door with the dramatic flair that had defined her personality since childhood. At 28, my younger sister had inherited our mother's delicate features and our father's commanding presence, creating a combination that had opened doors and melted hearts throughout her life. While I had always been the responsible one, good grades, steady job, sensible choices, Melissa was the golden child who could do no wrong even when she did everything wrong. Sorry, I'm late, she announced, her cheeks flushed and her eyes unnaturally bright. I was on the phone with Brad trying to convince him to propose already. I mean, Sarah's getting married tomorrow and I've been with Brad for 6 months, longer than she's been with David. I felt the familiar sting of comparison that had poisoned our relationship since childhood, but the tea was already making me drowsy, dulling the sharp edges of my irritation. My eyelids grew heavy and the room seemed to tilt slightly as if I were viewing everything through water. Melissa, don't be ridiculous, our mother said, but her tone lacked conviction. Everyone has their own timeline, do they though? Melissa's voice took on a sharp edge that cut through my growing haze. Because I'm tired of being overshadowed. I'm tired of Sarah getting everything first just because she's older. I'm tired of being the afterthought. The teacup slipped from my fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. I tried to stand to clean up the mess, but my legs wouldn't support me. The room spun faster now, and I had to grip the bedpost to keep from falling. What did you put in that tea? I managed to whisper, but the words came out slurred and distant. Melissa stepped closer, her face transforming into something I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. Cut Her hair off, she said, her voice rising to just below a scream. Or you'll lose me forever, I swear to God, Mama, if you don't do this one thing for me, I will walk out of this house tonight and you will never see me again. Through the sedative fog I watched my mother's face crumble as if Melissa had physically struck her. Margaret Montgomery, who prided herself on maintaining control in every situation, began to cry, not the delicate tears of a southern lady but ugly desperate sobs that shook her entire body. Please don't make me choose, she whispered, but we all knew she already had. The sound of clippers cutting through my hair, and I knew I'd lost much more than just my appearance. Consciousness returned slowly, like swimming up from the bottom of a murky pond. My mouth tasted like cotton and copper, and there was a strange coolness across my scalp that I couldn't immediately place. The morning light filtering through my childhood bedroom curtains seemed harsher than usual, and when I tried to sit up, the world tilted dangerously to one side. The sedative still clung to my system like cobwebs, making every movement feel sluggish and disconnected. It wasn't until I swung my legs over the edge of the bed that I noticed the hair thick dark strands scattered across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves, catching the sunlight in a way that made my stomach lurch. My hand instinctively went to my head, expecting to feel the familiar weight of the shoulder-length waves I'd been growing out for 2 years specifically for this day. Instead, my palm met bare skin. The walk to my bathroom mirror felt like crossing a desert. Each step brought a growing sense of dread that crystallized into horror the moment I flicked on the overhead light. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable. Where my hair had been, there were only uneven patches of stubble and angry red welts where the clippers had been pressed too hard against my scalp. Melissa hadn't just cut my hair, she had scalped me with the precision of someone who wanted to inflict maximum damage. I raised trembling fingers to trace the geography of my destruction. The skin was tender and raw in places, with tiny cuts that had scabbed over during the night. Some areas were completely bald, while others had tufts of hair no longer than a quarter-inch, creating a landscape of humiliation that no amount of makeup or strategic lighting could disguise. The sensation of touching my own scalp was alien and violating, as if I were exploring someone else's body. My fingertips, usually soft from expensive hand cream, felt rough and foreign against the unfamiliar texture of exposed skin. The bathroom door creaked open behind me, and I saw my mother's reflection join mine in the mirror. Margaret Montgomery looked like she had aged a decade overnight. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her silk nightgown wrinkled, and her carefully maintained composure had cracked like old paint. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other's reflections, two women standing in the wreckage of a relationship that could never be repaired. Sarah, honey, she began, her voice carefully modulated in that tone she used when trying to manage a crisis at one of her charity events. You're still beautiful in your own way. Hair grows back, and there are lovely wigs we can find for today. Nobody has to know what really happened. The casual dismissal of my violation hit me like a physical blow. She was already spinning the narrative, already crafting the lie that would protect the family's reputation while erasing my pain. Before I could respond, my father's voice drifted in. I had watched him orchestrate these meetings since childhood, observing how he wielded his authority with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. He would stand at the head of our mahogany table gesturing toward printed reports and architectural plans while the other board members hung on his every word. During these gatherings, my mother would glide between the kitchen and dining room, serving her famous praline cake and sweet tea in crystal glasses that had been in her family for 4 generations. She never spoke during the official proceedings, but her presence was essential to the performance. Margaret Montgomery was the living embodiment of Southern hospitality, the gracious hostess whose very existence proved that traditional values and family stability still thrived in our rapidly changing world. The other wives would compliment her on everything from her flower arrangements to her daughter's accomplishments, and she would deflect with practiced modesty while ensuring that every positive detail about our family was subtly woven into the conversation. The church committee meetings followed a similar pattern, though with an added layer of moral authority that made my parents practically untouchable in our community. First Baptist Church of Magnolia Springs wasn't just where we worshiped, it was where social hierarchies were established and maintained through a complex web of committee positions, volunteer roles, and financial contributions. My father had served as a deacon for 15 years, while my mother led the Ladies' Auxiliary and organized the annual charity auction that raised funds for the children's ministry. Together they represented everything the congregation aspired to be: successful, devoted, and blessed with a family that reflected God's favor. I had lost count of how many times I had heard my parents referenced as examples during sermons or Sunday school lessons. Pastor Williams would speak about the importance of raising children with strong Christian values, and inevitably someone would mention how fortunate the church was to have families like the Montgomerys, who had produced 2 daughters destined for bright futures. The irony was suffocating. Our family was held up as a model of Christian love and support when the reality behind closed doors was manipulation, favoritism, and emotional abuse disguised as family loyalty. The wedding itself had been planned as the ultimate performance, a grand finale to decades of careful image management. When David and I announced our engagement 18 months ago, my mother immediately began treating the event like a political campaign, with guest lists that read like a who's who of Magnolia Springs society. The invitation list included not just family and friends, but every influential person in our community: the mayor and his wife, the bank president, the country club board of directors, and naturally Pastor Williams and his entire family. Margaret had explained that a wedding was an opportunity to celebrate our blessings while demonstrating our family's continued prominence in the social fabric of our town. She had chosen Magnolia Hills Country Club as the venue specifically because it was the most prestigious location in our area, the kind of place where exclusivity was measured not just by membership fees but by generational legacy. The ballroom where my reception would take place had hosted the wedding celebrations of senators' daughters and Fortune 500 executives' children. Having our family celebration in that sacred space would cement our status among the community elite while providing the perfect backdrop for the hundreds of photographs that would eventually grace our Christmas cards and social media accounts for years to come. But now, standing in my childhood bathroom with my scalp bearing the evidence of my family's true nature, I understood that this wedding had never been about celebrating my happiness or honoring my relationship with David. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of the Montgomery family brand, a spectacular demonstration of our ability to raise successful, beautiful daughters who married well and reflected positively on their upbringing. Melissa's jealousy and my parents' willingness to accommodate it had revealed the ugly truth beneath decades of carefully maintained facades. As I watched my parents hover in the bathroom doorway, I noticed something that might have escaped me in the immediate shock of discovery. Neither of them could look directly at my head. My father kept his eyes fixed on a point just over my left shoulder, while my mother stared intently at her own reflection in the mirror, as if seeing my destruction might somehow contaminate her own appearance. They were already calculating the damage to their reputation, already crafting explanations and contingency plans to minimize the social fallout from what they had done. The realization hit me like lightning. They weren't worried about my pain or my humiliation. They were terrified that their carefully constructed image might crumble when 200 of their closest friends and most important social contacts saw what they had allowed to happen to their elder daughter. The very stage they had designed to showcase their family's perfection would instead become the platform for their complete destruction. If they worshipped image, I would destroy them on that very stage under the blinding lights. The sound of footsteps on the hardwood stairs interrupted the tense silence that had settled over my bathroom like a burial shroud. My parents immediately straightened, their faces transforming into masks of casual normality with the practiced ease of decades of social performance. But I recognized those particular footsteps, measured, deliberate, and completely unintimidated by the Montgomery family's carefully orchestrated drama. Aunt Ruth had arrived. Ruth Montgomery Whitfield was my father's older sister, a woman who had earned her independence through 40 years of teaching high school English and had never felt the need to apologize for speaking uncomfortable truths. At 68, she moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had witnessed Enough family secrets to be shocked by very little. Unlike my parents who measured their worth through community approval and social standing, Ruth had built her life around book students and a small circle of genuine friendships that had sustained her through decades of watching the Montgomery family dysfunction from the periphery. Well, she said as she appeared in the bathroom doorway, her silver hair pulled back in its characteristic neat bun and her blue eyes taking in the scene with the analytical precision of someone assessing a particularly complex piece of literature. I see we're having quite the morning drama. My mother immediately launched into damage control mode, her voice taking on that artificially bright tone she used when trying to convince people that catastrophes were actually blessings in disguise. Ruth, thank goodness you're here early. Sarah had a little accident with some scissors last night. You know how nervous brides can get, and we're just figuring out the best way to style what's left for the ceremony. The lie was so blatant, so insulting to everyone's intelligence that I felt a fresh wave of rage wash over me, but Ruth simply raised one silver eyebrow and stepped fully into the bathroom, her presence immediately shifting the balance of power in the room. She had a way of occupying space that made everyone else feel smaller and less significant, not through intimidation but through the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades teaching teenagers and had therefore developed an immunity to manipulation and deception. Charles, Margaret, she said, her voice carrying the same tone she had probably used with countless students caught cheating on examinations. I think, Sarah, and I need a few minutes alone. Perhaps you could go downstairs and start preparing breakfast for your guests. It wasn't a suggestion, and everyone in the room understood that. My parents exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that long married couples develop before reluctantly retreating from the bathroom. I could hear their whispered conversation beginning before they even reached the stairs, no doubt crafting their next strategy for containing the damage to their reputation. Ruth waited until their footsteps faded before closing the bathroom door with a soft click. Then she reached into the large canvas bag she always carried and pulled out a collection of silk scarves in various shades of blue and gray, their fabric so soft and fine that they seemed to catch and hold the morning light. Without saying a word, she approached me and began gently draping one of the scarves around my head, her movements tender and careful in a way that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I've known about this for a long time, she said quietly, her fingers working with practiced skill to arrange the scarf in a way that covered my scalp while still looking elegant and intentional. Not the specific details of last night, but the pattern, the favoritism, the way they've always been willing to sacrifice your happiness to preserve Melissa's ego and their own social standing. Her words broke something loose inside me, and I found myself leaning into her touch like a child seeking comfort from the only adult who had ever offered it without conditions or expectations. Ruth had always been the family outlier, the Montgomery who had chosen books over babies, career over marriage, and truth over social acceptability. During my childhood, she had been the one who remembered my academic achievements and celebrated my small victories with the kind of genuine enthusiasm my parents reserved exclusively for Melissa's social triumphs. The thing is, sweetheart, Ruth continued, now securing the scarf with a small pin shaped like a silver leaf, technology has changed the game these days. Everything is recorded. They don't deserve to be part of our lives." The relief I felt at his words was overwhelming, like stepping out of a suffocating room into fresh air. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't alone. I had an ally who understood that this wasn't about vanity or wedding day jitters, but about fundamental respect and human dignity. David's response told me everything I needed to know about the man I was about to marry and the life we could build together, free from the toxic patterns that had defined my childhood. But I still hadn't told him everything, and that secret was burning inside me. The moment of intimate connection between David and me was shattered by the sharp sound of heels clicking against the marble floor of the country club hallway. I recognized that particular rhythm immediately, my mother's purposeful stride when she was on a mission to control a situation that was spiraling beyond her management capabilities. The bridal suite door swung open without so much as a courtesy knock, and Margaret Montgomery swept into the room like a force of nature determined to reshape reality through sheer willpower and social conditioning. She was impeccably dressed in her mother of the bride ensemble, a champagne-colored silk dress that had been selected specifically to photograph beautifully against the country club's elegant backdrop. Her makeup was flawless, her hair arranged in the kind of sophisticated updo that required 2 hours with a professional stylist, and her smile was the practiced expression of gracious hospitality that she had perfected over decades of hosting community events. To anyone who didn't know better, she looked like the picture of maternal pride and southern refinement, preparing to celebrate her daughter's most important day. "David, sweetheart, you look absolutely handsome," she said, immediately moving to embrace him with the kind of warm familiarity she reserved for people she considered valuable assets to the family's social standing. "I hope you're not too overwhelmed by all the excitement. These big weddings can be quite an adjustment for people who come from more modest backgrounds." The subtle dig at David's middle-class upbringing was delivered with such smooth precision that someone unfamiliar with my mother's techniques might have missed it entirely. But I caught it. David caught it, and I could see from Jessica's expression that she had caught it too. My mother had a gift for inserting small cruelties into seemingly innocent conversations, planting seeds of insecurity while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "Now then," my mother continued, turning her attention to me with the kind of forced brightness that indicated she was about to begin a campaign of damage control. "You still look beautiful in your own way, Sarah. Different, certainly, but we can work with different. The important thing is not to make a big deal out of this little setback, because the last thing we want is to embarrass ourselves in front of the neighbors and all the important people who have taken time out of their busy schedules to celebrate with us today." The words hit me like a series of calculated slaps, each phrase designed to minimize my trauma while maximizing my sense of obligation to protect the family's reputation. She wasn't asking me how I felt or whether I needed support or comfort. She was instructing me to prioritize her social standing over my own emotional well-being, just as she had been doing my entire life. The gaslighting was so smooth and practiced that I could almost admire the skill involved if it weren't being directed at me. In one of the most vulnerable moments of my life, my father appeared in the doorway behind her, his presence adding weight to her words through silent authority. Charles Montgomery commanded respect wherever he went, not through warmth or charisma, but through the kind of old-fashioned patriarchal gravitas that still carried significant power in Southern social circles. He was dressed in his finest suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression carrying the stern disapproval of a man who expected immediate compliance with his expectations. "The guests are already arriving," he said, his voice carrying the tone he used during HOA board meetings when he needed to establish that discussion was over and action was required. "The pastor is here along with the mayor and several members of the city council. We have an obligation to these people, Sarah. They've come here expecting to witness a celebration of family values and Southern grace, not some kind of dramatic spectacle that will give them something to gossip about for months." The cultural pressure he was applying was expertly calibrated to hit every button my upbringing had installed in our community. Reputation was everything, and the idea of causing embarrassment to important guests was treated as one of the most serious social crimes imaginable. The pastor, the mayor, the city council members, these were the people whose approval determined a family's standing in Magnolia Springs society. Disappointing them wasn't just a personal failure, it was a betrayal of the community values that defined our entire way of life. "Besides," my mother added, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a confidence, "we simply cannot afford to have anything go wrong today, not with everything we've invested in this event, and especially not with Melissa's situation being so delicate right now. You know, she's been struggling financially since she quit her job, and we've been helping her with the credit card debt she accumulated trying to keep up with her lifestyle. The poor thing is already so sensitive about being dependent on us again, and if this wedding becomes some kind of scandal, it will just make her feel even worse about herself." The mention of Melissa's financial troubles was delivered with such casual matter-of-factness that it took me a moment to process the implications of what my mother had just revealed. Melissa had quit her job without telling me, was apparently drowning in credit card debt, and was receiving financial support from our parents' information. That explained so much about the family dynamics that had led to last night's ultimatum. My sister wasn't just jealous of my wedding, she was financially dependent on our parents' continued favor, which gave them enormous leverage over her behavior. And decisions only Melissa knows the full extent of what we've had to do to keep her afloat. My mother continued, apparently unaware that she was providing me with crucial insight into the motivations behind the previous night's events. She's been so grateful for our support and so eager to find ways to contribute to the family. Sometimes I think she feels like she needs to prove her loyalty to us because we've been so generous with her during this difficult period. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place with devastating clarity. Melissa's ultimatum hadn't just been about jealousy or sibling rivalry, it had been about financial desperation and the fear of losing her parents' support if she didn't find a way to make herself indispensable to them. My humiliation had been the price of her continued solvency, and my parents had been willing to pay it without hesitation. I saw Aunt Ruth standing behind Mother, hearing everything, and her eyes flashed like a knife as if she was remembering a secret from grandmother's past. The flash of recognition in Aunt Ruth's eyes sent a chill down my spine, but before I could process what that look meant, she stepped forward and gently placed her hand on my mother's arm. "Margaret, dear, I think we should give Sarah and David a few more minutes alone before the ceremony," she said with the kind of quiet authority that had made her an effective teacher for 4 decades. "Why don't you and Charles go check on the final arrangements with the caterers? I'm sure there are last-minute details that need your attention." My parents exchanged one of their wordless communications before reluctantly agreeing to leave, though I could see the frustration in my mother's eyes at being dismissed before she could complete her damage control mission. The moment the door closed behind them, Ruth turned to me with an expression that was both sympathetic and determined. "Sarah, I think it's time you heard what that doorbell camera actually recorded last night," she said, pulling her smartphone from her purse with the careful movements of someone handling dynamite. "I downloaded the footage this morning while your parents were busy with their preparations. They don't know I have access to their security system, and they certainly don't know what I discovered." My heart began racing as Ruth navigated to her phone's video gallery and selected a file that was timestamped from the previous evening. The screen showed the familiar view from our front porch camera, the image quality surprisingly clear even in the dim lighting from the porch fixtures. For a moment there was nothing but the peaceful suburban scene of our neighborhood at night, and then the audio began. The sound quality was slightly crackling due to the outdoor recording conditions, but every word was audible with devastating clarity. First came Melissa's voice, sharp and demanding in a way that made my skin crawl as I heard it played back. The ultimatum was even more chilling when removed from the drugged haze that had clouded my perception the night before. Her words cut through the quiet evening air like shards of glass. "Cut her hair off or you'll lose me forever. I swear to God, Mama, if you don't do this one thing for me, I will walk out of this house tonight and you will never see me again." My mother's response followed, her voice thick with tears and the kind of desperation I had never heard from her before. "Please don't make me choose, Melissa, please. Don't ask me to hurt Sarah like this. There has to be another way." But even as she protested, I could hear the weakness in her voice, the way she was already that had been used to drug me despite the prescription being written for Melissa's supposed anxiety disorder. This changes everything, David said, studying the email timestamp that showed the transaction had been completed at 4:37 the previous afternoon. This wasn't your mother acting impulsively under pressure from Melissa. Your father was actively involved in planning what happened to you, and he was purchasing the means to drug you hours before Melissa's ultimatum. The implications were staggering. The narrative I had constructed in my mind of my mother being manipulated into a terrible decision by my sister's emotional blackmail was crumbling under the weight of evidence that suggested a much more calculated conspiracy. My father, the respected deacon and community leader who prided himself on moral authority and family values, had been planning my humiliation with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to HOA board meetings and church committee work. Ruth carefully forwarded the pharmacy receipt to both David and me, ensuring that we would have copies even if something happened to her phone or email account. She also took additional photographs of the prescription bottle, focusing on details that connected it to the email receipt: the prescription number, the pharmacy identification codes, and the date stamps that proved the medication had been acquired specifically for the previous night's events. As we prepared to leave the storage area, I realized that we had assembled a collection of evidence that would be impossible for my family to explain away or dismiss. The audio recording proved what had been said and by whom. The prescription bottle and receipt proved premeditation and planning, and the physical remains of my hair along with the clippers provided tangible proof of the assault itself. It was the kind of comprehensive documentation that could support criminal charges if I chose to pursue them, and it certainly provided more than enough evidence to destroy my family's carefully maintained reputation. Putting the pieces together, I had the complete picture of betrayal, and one missing piece was waiting to emerge from the grave of family secrets. Armed with our collection of damning evidence, we made our way back through the country club's corridors toward the bridal preparation area, where I knew the final hour before the ceremony would be filled with last-minute adjustments and the kind of nervous energy that always preceded major family events. But as we rounded the corner near the main ballroom, I found myself face to face with the person I least wanted to see at that moment. Melissa was waiting in the hallway, dressed in her maid of honor gown and looking every inch the perfect Southern belle she had always been trained to be. She had positioned herself strategically near the entrance to the bridal suite, clearly intending to intercept me before I could retreat to the safety of my preparation room. Her appearance was flawless as always, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate updo that had probably required 2 hours with a professional stylist. Her makeup applied with the kind of precision that made her look like she was ready for a magazine photo shoot, and her sage green bridesmaid dress fitting her figure in a way that emphasized every curve. To any casual observer, she would have appeared to be the picture of sisterly support, ready to help her older sibling through the final moments before walking down the aisle. But I could see something else in her eyes, something desperate and calculating that made my skin crawl with recognition. This wasn't the confident golden child who had issued ultimatums the night before. This was someone who had spent the morning watching her carefully orchestrated plan begin to unravel, and who was now scrambling to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond her management capabilities. Sarah, she said, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone she had always used when she wanted something from me. I was hoping we could have a few minutes alone before the ceremony, sister, to clear the air about everything that happened last night. David immediately stepped closer to me, his protective instincts clearly activated by something in Melissa's demeanor that struck him as threatening rather than conciliatory. Ruth also positioned herself slightly behind Melissa, close enough to intervene if the conversation took a turn toward confrontation. I could feel their support like a physical presence, reminding me that I wasn't alone in facing whatever manipulation my sister was about to attempt. I think we've said everything that needs to be said, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Unless you're here to apologize for drugging me and destroying my appearance on my wedding day, I don't see what we have to discuss. Melissa's carefully constructed mask of sisterly concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and ugly underneath before she managed to reassemble her expression into something resembling wounded innocence. Sarah, you're being so dramatic about this. It's just hair and it will grow back. Besides, you look fine, different but fine. The casual dismissal of what had been done to me was so perfectly in character that I almost laughed at the predictability of it. But then Melissa stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that was clearly meant to exclude David and Ruth from the conversation, and her next words hit me like a physical blow. Do you think he only loves you? She asked, her eyes flicking toward David with an expression that was impossible to misread. I mean, really think about it, Sarah. What if there are things you don't know about his feelings? What if you're not as secure in this relationship as you think you are? The question was delivered with such practiced malice that it took my breath away. This wasn't just about hair or wedding day drama or even financial dependency on our parents. This was about something much more personal and destructive, the suggestion that my relationship with David, the one thing in my life that had remained pure and untouched by my family's toxicity, might itself be built on lies or deception. I watched Melissa's face carefully as she continued her psychological assault, noting the way her eyes kept darting toward David as if she were Gauging his reaction to her words, there was something hungry in her expression, something that spoke of long-held desires and carefully nursed grievances that went far beyond normal sibling rivalry. She wasn't just trying to hurt me, she was trying to plant seeds of doubt that would poison my marriage before it even began. You know, Sarah, there was a time when David and I spent quite a bit of time together, she continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that was clearly designed to suggest romantic rather than platonic interactions. Those coffee meetings when you were working late, the conversations we had about your relationship, the way he used to look at me when he thought no one was watching. Did you ever wonder what we talked about during those long afternoons? The words hit their intended target with surgical precision. I did remember those coffee meetings, though I had never thought of them as anything more than my sister's attempts to get to know the man I was planning to marry. David had mentioned them in passing, usually in the context of complaining about Melissa's tendency to monopolize conversations and turn every discussion back to herself, but now filtered through my sister's poisonous insinuations. Those innocent interactions took on a more sinister cast. In my mind, I found myself studying David's face, looking for any sign of guilt or recognition that might validate Melissa's implications, but instead of the discomfort I might have expected if there were truth to her suggestions, I saw something else entirely, a kind of disgusted recognition, as if he were finally understanding the full extent of my sister's manipulation and psychological cruelty. He used to look at me differently, Melissa added, her voice dropping to an even more intimate whisper, like he was seeing something in me that he couldn't find in you. I'm not saying anything happened, of course, but there was definitely a connection there, a spark, the kind of thing that makes you wonder what might have been if circumstances had been different. The lies were so transparent, so obviously designed to create maximum emotional damage, that I felt my anger crystallizing into something harder and more focused than rage. This wasn't just about destroying my wedding day or humiliating me in front of our community. This was about dismantling my entire sense of reality, making me question not just my family relationships but the one romantic partnership that had given me hope for building a life free from their toxicity. But as I looked at Melissa's face, studying the desperate hunger in her eyes and the way her hands were trembling slightly as she delivered her carefully rehearsed poison, I realized that she had revealed more about herself than she intended. This wasn't the confident manipulation of someone who held power, this was the flailing attack of someone who had lost control and was trying to inflict as much damage as possible before being completely exposed. I responded coldly, "Today isn't your day," and her eyes flashed with anger, hiding an old wound. Melissa's flash of anger confirmed what I had suspected. Beneath her carefully constructed manipulations lay a wound that ran much deeper than simple sibling rivalry. But I didn't have time to analyze the psychological complexities of my sister's motivations. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours, and I needed to ensure that my carefully planned revelation would proceed without interference from my family's damage control efforts. With David and Ruth flanking me like protective sentries, I made my way toward the chapel.